There is in the gate of hell in Dante's Inferno the motto, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." And I think that we have a kind of a collective image of what hell is supposed to look like or be like, whether it's literal hellfire in some people's conception or whether this is all a metaphor. That's neither here nor there, maybe. But the idea is brimstone, fire, pools, torture, demons torturing souls. Not a happy place by any means, but a kind of a consistent viewpoint of how it's portrayed, maybe in the imagination and also in popular culture, even in different religious imagery. So here in the pop culture, from South Park, the South Park movie, Satan is a fairly major character, and I think this is actually a pretty reasonable approximation, the cartoon here, of the popular version of Satan, a big red being with horns, a little beard, and so on. Goats, you can't see it here, it's cut off, but anyway, like goats' legs and hoofs and that kind of thing, a tail. So I'm going to suggest that the image that we have right now of both hell and Satan are actually substantially influenced by two great epic poets of the Middle Ages and then early modern period, Dante, who we are just referenced, and Milton. And so let's look at those for a second. So Dante, in the early 14th century, Dante published an epic poem called the Divine Comedy. It's divided into three major parts, the Inferno, which is to say hell, the Purgatorio, the purgatory, the space where the departed are purged of their sins before being able to move on to paradise, and the Paradiso, heaven. And so it's a kind of a long description, an allegory, and so on and so forth, of the Christian afterlife. To my thinking, this in some way is a novelization of Thomas Aquinas, who is the great philosopher and theologian of the Middle Ages, who has taken the major project of the intellectual project of the Christian Middle Ages, which is taking the rediscovery of Aristotle, this philosopher who held sway intellectually over the Western world for well over 1,000 years. As Aristotle was recovered in the Christian West, taking all of Aristotle's idea challenges and Christianizing them in order to make it consistent with Christian theology, which had been much closer focused to Aristotle's teacher Plato prior to this time. Ultimately, Aquinas's philosophy and theology are a synthesis of Plato, Aristotle, and Christianity, and he essentially creates an entire cosmological system, and the Inferno, the Purgatorio, the Paradiso of Dante sort of popularized that by setting it all to poetry. And so of these three books in the Divine Comedy, the Inferno is by far and away the most popular. It turns out that when you are describing, heaven and everything is, nice and wonderful and everybody's there and one with God and praising God and this sort of thing, it's not as exciting dramatically. So when you try to create literature where there's no conflict, it's not as good of literature as when there is conflict and problems and characters that are less than perfect. And indeed, Dante has a fun program of taking all of the figures of history, including very near contemporaries to him, and assigning to them whether they're in paradise and purgatory, or more often hell, and why they're in hell and what's happening to them in hell. And so that became quite a popular to this day, genre of kind of Christian fantasy or something. So, again, the popular conception continues. One of the things that Dante shows is this idea is that there are people who did certain things in life. They're punished accordingly, and so this is portrayed in The Simpsons, where Homer sold his soul and is spending a day in hell, and he has to go to the ironic punishments division. And so one of the things that Homer is, of course, is a glutton and loves donuts. And so the little demon here is more or less saying, "Oh, you like donuts, do you? Well, have all the donuts in the universe." and so they're just force feeding Homer donut after donut after donut after donut, and he doesn't have more than a second. But as they reload, and when they reload every single time, he still says more, more. And so it's unfortunately the irony here for the little demon that is trying to punish Homer ironically. The double irony here is that that's no punishment at all. Homer's pretty much in his own paradise from this punishment. All right, so we talked about what does that mean when I'm saying it's a novelization of Aristotle and Plato. Well, so the cosmology here, we sometimes call this cosmology Ptolemaic. So Claudius Ptolemy, is the late Greco-Roman philosopher, scientist, who essentially created what had been the Aristotelian scheme, but he systematizes it a lot more of how the universe works. Essentially, Ptolemy's universe, it has Earth at its center, and then there are these celestial spheres that have the 7 celestial planets. And the planets are essentially, when you go out in the night sky, we don't do this as much, or the day sky, and you see objects that are moving around against the backdrop, and they move in an orderly way. Like, for example, the sun, which goes by observation. Morning it goes up and it goes down, and at the night, and then it's hidden from view throughout the night. Essentially, the idea of it here is that planets are those bodies that wander around the night sky or day sky like that. So they're Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Those are the unfixed bodies that are visible to naked eye observation, and they move against then the field of the fixed stars that all move together. As far as we can see from the Earth, obviously we know that that's not how it actually operates, but this is how Ptolemy was able to create a system based on observation that predicted the movements of all of those bodies quite effectively. And so the cosmology of Dante, and indeed underneath that Aquinas, is sort of a Christian add-on of that earlier pagan natural philosophy, the essentially ancient science, the cosmology of Ptolemy that Ptolemy developed in the 2nd century based on earlier work of Aristotle. So in this particular vision then, paradise, the idea, heaven, is placed above the stellar sphere, so outside of all of these crystal spheres, so above even or outside of that zone where the fixed stars are, and then beneath the surface of the Earth. The Earth, we'll just mention, everybody in the Middle Ages understood that the Earth was a sphere. The way this whole universe works is the Earth is a sphere and it's surrounded by spheres. The idea that anybody thought that the world was flat, the idea that Columbus thought the world was flat, or that Columbus was proving the world was round is a 19th century myth. That's not the case at all. So they understood the world, Earth is a sphere, and then what they understand is that there are within the sphere of Earth 9 circles of hell that are this idea that we're talking about tonight. So this area that is ruled over by the devil and the demons, where souls are punished. All right, so that's Dante and and the Inferno. A second poem here in the early modern time period that was very influential, especially in English, is John Milton's poem Paradise Lost, published in 1667. And so Paradise Lost is envisioned as, and in some way becomes, the great English language epic. And Milton begins with a story of a war in heaven. So prior to Adam and Eve, prior to the creation of the world, or before anyway it gets going, there is a fight among the different angels, and there is an expulsion of Lucifer and the fallen angels. And this is drawn from a description. Milton is getting this from the book of Revelation, but it's actually a misreading of the book of Revelation. We've had a different lecture of this. This is not actually something that happens in a pre-existence according to the book of Revelation, but rather it's a future event. But in any event, it becomes the backdrop for the story of creation. And then Milton, in doing it, again, in the same exact way that the Inferno is the most popular component of Dante's work, because, again, perfect characters and people that don't have challenges, people that are living in paradise, there's nothing to that dramatically. It's not going to make for good literature. And so in that same exact way, the character of Lucifer, the character of the angel that rebels against God and leads this rebellion, is expelled in the war in heaven and goes down to earth. This character becomes actually pretty sympathetic in Milton because we understand maybe why the character acts that way within this epic. And so there's a very famous quote: "It's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." And that isn't entirely an alien idea to modern individualists. A lot of folks are not big on serving, and so in other words, even if you're in a terrible place, it's better to be in the lead position than it is to be in a servant position in paradise. And so whether or not that's the case, that's certainly the case that Lucifer makes in Paradise Lost. Okay, so both of these ideas, Dante's and Milton's, are actually based on a medieval conception of hell. I have here in the illustration just a beautiful illumination from a medieval manuscript from the 12th century. And I always think these are always amazing, where you have all of the little demons and devils that are doing all of these horrible torture things to all of the souls of the damned. And then, of course, it's very accentuated with fire. That's doesn't come out of nowhere. It's certainly how people in the Middle Ages are picturing hell. And so what are some of these bullet points? So it contains souls who are damned, they're tortured, it's full of all this fire imagery, it's where demons are, it's ruled over by the devil, and it's eternal, and it lasts forever. And so both of these are highlighted, I think, in Dante and Milton, and they draw completely to our modern conception that we maybe have of this, whether we take it literally or not. This is our vision maybe of hell. The devil, this is also a medieval image. So the devil, we've had a whole lecture before called A Brief Biography of the Devil. The devil evolved a little bit more than maybe the conception of hell. We now really have this idea of this red guy with the horns and the goat legs and things like that, which is in some ways got swapped out from the Roman god and Greek god Pan. And so the imagery, in fact, in the Middle Ages, you can kind of see in this particular illumination of the devil is much more wacky, I'd say, than that. In other words, this strange cacophony, this chaos being, is what they're trying to portray here. And so that's more what things were looking like, let's say 1,000 years ago, and it's subsequently that this kind of Greek god Pan, most of his attributes were brought across, and we now kind of picture the devil in this kind of alternate way. Nevertheless, what is consistent is the idea of the devil is that the devil is the incarnation of the force of evil, the idea, the Platonic idea of evil. The idea here also that's been consistent is that the devil rules over hell and indeed wants to actually win souls for hell. Is getting something out of bringing people down with him, and is that thereby also the source of temptation. There's a bunch of alternate names, and so the devil is called Satan, which means the adversary, or Lucifer, which means son of the morning, or Beelzebub, which means lord of the flies, and also titles like the old serpent, and already in the Middle Ages and all through is considered a fallen angel. So this, we've also had a lecture, and we're probably going to return to it, this idea of angelology in the Judeo-Christian cosmology. There is the idea that angels are actually a separate creation from animals, humans. Angels is a different thing. More recently, there's an idea, it's very popularized in movies like Miracle on 34th Street or whatever. No, it's what's it called? It's another Christmas movie. I can't remember. It's a movie where Jimmy Curtis is, and I can't remember his name. Anyway, I can't remember this movie. But anyway, the point of it is that the angels get their wings, and the angels are souls of the departed. You guys are going to be able to tell me this in the comments. I don't know why I'm having this brain problem. But anyway, the idea of it is, Jimmy Stewart has a credit union, and he dies. He wishes he would never have lived, and an angel prevents him from dying, and this is like a lower tier angel who is actually just a ghost who is earning his wings. That's totally different from the classical and medieval conception of angels, which are totally separate from humanity. Humans aren't angels in the original idea. And so in this different conception, there was a time period when there are angels and devils. Angels that have free will. They make decisions, and the ones that make the wrong decision become the fallen angels. So thank you. Someone in the comments has said, "It's a Wonderful Life." That's what I'm trying to get at. So thank you so much. Okay. So the devil and the Gospels. So if we draw our line backwards then from our modern conception to our medieval and early modern epics, backwards, we get to the Gospels, we get to the New Testament, and it does turn out that in the New Testament, both the devil and also hell exist in New Testament a lot. So, for example, our earliest Gospels are Mark, which is the earliest Gospel we have intact, and then Q, which is the lost gospel, the source gospel for the sayings of Jesus that exist in Matthew and Luke. So those early gospels, every one of you is saying It's a Wonderful Life. I'm sorry that I couldn't remember that in the moment. So yeah, anyway, so both our earliest Gospels that survive, Q is lost but is preserved in Matthew and Luke. They have stories that Jesus is tempted by the devil while fasting in the wilderness after the episode with John the Baptist and immediately prior to his own public ministry. So it's a very early episode in the Gospels and important. And so one of the other things that happens very routinely in all the Gospels is that Jesus performs healing miracles that include casting out various demons. And then also Jesus does talk about in the Gospels Satan and Satan's kingdom. And so those are definitely very clear episodes that are happening in the Gospels and in the words that the Gospel evangelists attribute to Jesus. So Jesus has numerous teachings that include the idea of hell. So, for example, from Matthew 5:29, he says, "If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell." We also have the idea that is especially popularized in the Apostles' Creed, so a very early Christian creedal idea about what it means, what the kind of things that you need to believe in order to be a Christian, that after Jesus was crucified and before he was resurrected, there's the phrase that he descended into hell. And so the idea of that is, and there's a lot of artwork of this, of the harrowing of hell, that Jesus goes then to bring salvation to all the souls of the dead that had existed prior to the resurrection, so that they are also given the option and the opportunity for salvation and ultimately for resurrection. And so again, that souls are in hell and that Jesus descended into hell. And we don't have to even, we even come to the apocalypse. So the apocalypse of John, the apocalypse that made it into the New Testament, it's one of the richest sources of imagery in general in Christianity, because it's such a elaborate visionary word paintings that exist in it. And so as a result of that, it's also one of the richest New Testament sources for imagery of both the devil and of hell, that are kind of found in the book of the Apocalypse, and then also inspired medieval and frankly early modern people to make artwork of hell and what hell might be like, as from their reading of it. Okay, so we do have then a pretty elaborate, I mean, there's been changes, as we sort of have seen, but there's a kind of a dotted line that takes us all the way back to the time of Jesus, or at least to the time of the Christians who are writing down what Jesus said. But what about the idea of devil and hell in the Old Testament? So we have a real well-established modern conception of the devil and hell. We have the New Testament, and we might expect, because we might expect Christianity to be consistent with what went before, and that indeed the way the cosmos works maybe is the same from the moment of creation and even before until the present and to the future. We might expect, therefore, to find a similar conception and emphasis in the Old Testament, but contrary to that expectation, in fact, the Old Testament doesn't read like Milton or Dante, and in fact, both the devil and hell are conspicuously absent from the Hebrew Bible, which dates several centuries anyway before the time of Jesus. So, for example, when we start at the beginning with Genesis, Genesis doesn't begin the way Milton's Paradise Lost does, with the pre-existent Lucifer and the war in heaven. None of that is existing in the Bible. That doesn't happen in the Old Testament. Although the New Testament writers identify the serpent in the Eden story with the devil, this is actually a much later interpretation of the story. So there's actually no indication that the author of this portion of Genesis, and we've talked about that as one of the creative stories of the or Yahwist author of the book of Genesis, there's no idea that this author had any idea that the serpent is anything other than a snake. The original story really here is more like a fable than anything else. And certainly, if this is meant to be the cosmic incarnation of evil, what's quite striking is that this character does not recur. So even though right after, one of the very next stories in the J narrative is the story of Cain and Abel, it's not that a serpent or the devil in a different form now comes and tempts Cain to murder. In fact, that doesn't exist at all. There is no mention of any such thing. And so the character does not recur at all. It is simply a character of a snake who In the case of the Adam and Eve, the Eden fable here, it isn't, the snake doesn't actually even, I don't know, isn't necessarily even evil if you read the story. It's actually pointing different things out that aren't anyway, is not what you might expect of the worst force of evil altogether. So you might go and say, well, wait a second, Satan, as you remember, is in the book of Job. So yes, the word, the Satan, which is a translation, or not a translation, untranslated, it means the adversary. It exists in the book of Job, which is a later book, actually written over the course of a couple centuries in different component chunks. The character occurs there, but that character is very clearly not the devil in the sense of the devil as an incarnation of evil, because the Satan in the book of Job is very clearly part of the heavenly court. So we read in Job 1:6, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. So he's one of the sons of God here, and he is part of the court. Specifically, he's the part of the court, the adversary or the accuser, who's essentially operating, let's say, in a parliamentary system as the loyal opposition, the head of the opposition party, the Senate minority leader, whatever you want to call it. And so in the course of this, Satan, in the course of the book of Job, wagers with God that Job, who is a very righteous and blameless person, that God points out to Satan, is only righteous because God has given him so many blessings. And so although it's very clear from the narrative that Job is entirely blameless, God gives Job over to the Satan in order to prove that the Satan is wrong. In other words, that he would still be very righteous regardless. And so if Satan here was the devil, the force of cosmic evil, this seems like a pretty bizarre thing for God to be doing. So I think that this definitely paints a different kind of picture, a pre-development of the idea picture of a different character here. Primarily in Job, the idea of the Satan is the accuser, adversary. It also occurs in the writings of just one of the prophets, Zechariah, and in one psalm. So there's not even a lot for this. I mean, it's in Job, certainly, and then a couple other mentions here. There's certainly no imagery such as horns or cloven hoofs. They're not saying that that's what the guy would look like. He's not represented as the cosmic power of evil, simply a member of the heavenly court. And as I mentioned, more like a independent council that God appoints. Okay, what about Lucifer? You say, well, Lucifer, that exists in the Old Testament, right? So there is a mention of Lucifer in Isaiah, and I want to look at that kind of closely here. And so Isaiah 14 reads, how you have fallen from heaven, morning star, which is to say Lucifer, son of the dawn. This sounds like, again, that imagery that we have from Milton of the war in heaven, the fallen angel being cast out. You have been cast down to earth, you who once laid low the nations. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the Mount of Assembly, on the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to the realm of the dead, to the depths of the pit. Those who see you stare at you and ponder at your fate. Is this the man who shook the earth and made kingdoms tremble, the man who made the world a wilderness, who overthrew its cities and would not let his captives go home? So this is there's a bunch of mixture here, and you can kind of see where, again, being thrown down from the heavens, the equivalence here of the morning star, of Lucifer, of this front reference here to being in the realm of the dead, in the depths of the pit. You can kind of see that this is the source of a lot of Satan imagery, And yet, very clearly in this passage, which is where this imagery actually comes from, this passage is very clearly talking about a man. This is a man who shook the earth, who made the kingdoms tremble, a man who overthrew cities and would not let captives go home. Specifically, the captives of Judea, the Jews who were captive in Babylon, the Babylonian captivity. This is, in fact, a very direct and explicit taunting of somebody who had been a king, one of the kings of Babylon, who had, in fact, compared himself to one of the gods, who had said that he was the planet Venus, which, as you can, if you can imagine, in ancient times, the reason why we call Venus after the Roman goddess of love, and we call Mars after the Roman god of war, and Jupiter after the Roman king of the gods, is that the planets are felt as equivalent of gods, and the king of Babylon was calling himself a god on earth, and calling him, and specifically equating himself with the morning star, the evening star, which is to say Venus, which is the brightest of the object in the night sky, other than the moon, the brightest of the moving stars, the planets. And so what he's more or less saying here is, you've died. So you might have called yourself a god, but you're just a mortal man, and now you're dead, and you're in the realm of the dead. It's not that you're ruling over the realm of the dead because you're a fallen angel or any such thing. This is just talking about a king. But this is the image. This is where the word Lucifer comes from in the biblical conception, and this is where these images that get pulled into the book of Revelation and ultimately into Milton, that this is where this actually comes from, a misreading of this passage. So, although Isaiah's Lucifer, and then when we have Lucifer here, Lightbringer is what that means in Latin. It's the Latin version of the original Hebrew here, Hallel ben Shahar. This is an explicit condemnation of a Babylonian king. Nevertheless, as we've seen, Isaiah's imagery is the source for much of the New Testament imagery of Satan. And so this idea of being cast down from heaven to hell, to Sheol, as it would be called in the Hebrew here, to the pit, as it's called in Revelation. And again, there's an attempted idea that he's attempting to rival God in heaven, and that's certainly what the motivation is anyway by the time we get to Milton. So just to review, as we're looking at the Old Testament and the Old Testament conception of the devil, we have these ideas: serpent, Satan, Lucifer, the devil. But the serpent really only exists in Genesis, in the very beginning of Genesis, and not recurring as actually a talking snake. That is not the equivalent of the Satan, who is a member of God's court, one of the sons of God, essentially one of the angels, but not a fallen angel. And that is not the same as Lucifer, who is a king of Babylon. And indeed, in none of those three, who are all different things in those different component sources of the Hebrew Bible, do we find a cosmic evil figure, the devil. There's really no conception of the devil at all to be found in the Old Testament. All right, so that's the devil. But what about hell? So Old Testament authors envisioned a three-part cosmology with the heavens above, the earth in the middle, and Sheol below. I said before that Columbus wasn't teaching medieval people that that the world was not flat. In ancient Greece and all of its successors, the Romans, the medieval people, they all understood that the world was a sphere and so on. But before that, people really did think the world, several people did think the world was flat, and most of the Old Testament writers have that cosmology in mind. And so this is before ancient Greek natural philosophers, ancient Greek scientists, both proved that the world was round and also measured it quite accurately. And so again, the conception of the world as a world, a flat earth with four corners that's floating on waters. There's waters below, there's waters above, there's what's called a firmament, which is like a bowl, a transparent bowl that's keeping the waters above from getting into the air part. And then below the surface of the earth is hell, or Sheol, And so Sheol is the realm of the shades, the Rephaim of the dead, whether a good person has been good or bad in life. So there is no conception actually of heaven as an abode for righteous shades. So in the Old Testament, whenever they're talking about sleeping with the dead, all of the dead are essentially sleeping in the earth, buried in the earth, and nobody is going up and living in heaven or anything like that. There's no mention of that also in the Old Testament. So as a result, actually, there's neither heaven nor hell. And if we just think about it for a second, God is making covenants with the early patriarchs like Abraham, God isn't promising Abraham, boy, if you are righteous, if you do what I say here, if you adhere to this covenant, you're going to get eternal life. You're going to live eternally with me in heaven. No such promise is made in Genesis or Exodus or anywhere to any of the patriarchs or Old Testament figures. So Abraham rather is promised to be the father of many nations. He's blessed with health, with wealth, long life, posterity. There's a limit that the J author says that humans are set. It's like 110 years, and Abraham gets to live all the way up until the time limit, and then he dies and he sleeps with his ancestors in hell. But not hell, the kind of fiery punishment hell or anything like that. It's simply portrayed as sleeping. And so really the Old Testament lacks a developed conception of afterlife. There is no idea of spirits living on or bodies getting resurrected or any such thing in either heaven or hell. It's equated essentially, when it's talked about at all, with this a kind of unending eternal sleep that you have with all of everybody who went before. So how do we get from that Old Testament lack of conception for either a devil or hell or heaven even, to all of the way things are by the time you get to the time of Jesus? And so in the 4th centuries, between when the last Old Testament prophet, Malachi, who is writing, let's say in the 5th century BC, and we get to Jesus in maybe the year 30 AD. So the ancient Israelites, the ancient Jews, went from a limited conception of afterlife that did not include the devil or hell to a rather elaborated, developed sense of afterlife. And so that either included a spiritual or physical afterlife in a resurrected body. And their ideas also were already dualistic. And so it had separated into a heaven and a hell. And so there's two different ways you can do good and evil ends. And so the latter there, hell, included a cosmic devil. This was much more popular throughout Second Temple Judaism than modern rabbinic Judaism. And so Christianity actually takes a snapshot of a general Jewish idea that existed at Jesus's time, and then develops it and takes it on its own path. Whereas with most of rabbinic Judaism, the emphasis on afterlife is much, much less. And so most of these later ideas that are making their way into Second Temple Judaism are much less relevant anymore to rabbinic Judaism, which turned back to focusing on the earlier texts. These later texts did end up getting canonized into the Jewish scripture. So let's just look at kind of the difference that's separating that, 500 and about 400-year spread between that last text of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament for Christians, and the Christian texts of the New Testament. So in the earlier time period, when the bulk of the Old Testament texts are set and are being written, before the original destruction of Jerusalem in 587 by the Babylonians, when that happened, there had always been an influence over this transitional kingdom of Judah from either Egypt, which was the superpower to the west, or from Mesopotamia, Assyria, or Babylon, which is the superpower to the east. And when Judah was destroyed, when exiles independently fled, the army, for example, and Jeremiah and others fled in diaspora to Egypt, and ever after, there was a large Jewish community in Egypt. And then the Babylonians took a bunch of nobles, including the last kings and the last bits of the royal house, and brought them to their capital, Babylon, and that became known as the Babylonian captivity. And so, as a result of that, the two elites of this community are off in exile in diaspora, which is to say, not from in their homeland, but moved around as refugees and now living in courts of majority other people. As a result, the diaspora community in Egypt is very influenced by what's going on in Egypt, Egyptian ideas, and then likewise the ones that are off in Babylon are very much influenced by Babylonian ideas. And it only takes a generation or two before the heir of the house of David already has as his name Zerubbabel, which is a Babylonian name, and it actually has the word Babel in the name. And so in other words, that they are already being Babylonianized while they're there, and likewise the folks in Egypt are being Egyptianized. Ultimately, when we get to the Second Temple period, when the exiles from Babylon are allowed to come back, when they are allowed by the emperor of the Persians who conquers the Babylonian Empire to rebuild the temple and to create a minor Persian province centered on Jerusalem, then at that point there is a major influence from Persian ideas and also Mesopotamian ideas on Second Temple Israelites. And then meanwhile, what ends up happening on the other side, ultimately the Persian Empire is overthrown by Alexander the Great, and there are these Hellenistic empires, and in Egypt becomes the center of Greek intellectual activity with the founding of Alexandria. And so there's all of these ideas from the West that are impacting both the diaspora community and also the people that are in the province of Judea. And so essentially there is a long period of time here where Greek ideas are being introduced into Second Temple Judaism and also Persian ideas. And both of them have conceptions of afterlife, and they both have kinds of dualism, but in both cases they're a little bit different, and so they end up fighting each other out in what gets adopted or what develops in Judaism. Okay, so why do people need an idea of hell? So, as we've talked about, and at first they're perfectly able to have a religion in First Temple Judaism that doesn't have a developed conception of hell. Why is that? Why do people see that as a lack? And so I'm going to suggest that the reason why people wanted to have an idea of hell is that it is an interrelated solution for two key questions. And so one of the things that develops both from the Greeks philosophically and also from the Persians in terms of their own monotheistic, dualistic religion, Zoroastrianism, is the idea that God is not simply the God of your own little community. God is not simply the God of Babylon or the God of Greece or something like that. It's not simply Zeus and there's all these other gods, but actually there is one God that is the source of all of these gods. And the Greeks even start to have this, even though they continue to see the other minor gods as being emanations of that. The philosophers in ancient Greece are proposing that there's essentially one source of meaning, God. And so if God is universal, if God is omnipotent and good, and if God blesses the righteous and punishes the wicked, the question that arises then is, why is it that the wicked often seem to prosper while the righteous often suffer? And if that seems to be happening every day in our lives, as the righteous continue to suffer and the wicked continue to prosper. And then another thing that happens is there is a development in this time period of an ancient idea of the individual, and people now, as they remove themselves from kin group. And so it used to be all right if maybe you have, as an individual, have passed on or sleeping with your ancestors because as that promise went to Abraham, you become the father of many nations. In other words, your kin group continues on, and that's all that really matters. Well, now in antiquity, people are pulled away from full-on identification with being with a kin group, and are now really starting to focus on their own individual identity. And so then they're starting to ask, well, wait a second, what happens to me though? So yeah, sure, the Hivites are all going to continue, the Kenites are going to continue because of the many nations that are going to be going on. But what about me? What happens to me after death? I'm just going to be sitting down in Sheol sleeping forever? And so when we were back in terms of, this is classically called the problem of evil, the first of these questions. So when we were back in First Temple Judaism, in the core components of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, what we can kind of see is that the worship of Jehovah, of Yahweh, evolved from polytheism, which is to say a pantheon of many gods where Yahweh was one God among many, to henotheism, which is to say the sole worship of a chief God who has other rivals. There's more gods, but really we should be worshiping this God, to ultimately the development of monotheism into Second Temple Judaism, the worship of one cosmic, universal, eternal God. And so that's where this problem of evil really develops as a logical consequence. If you have all of these other gods and bad things happen to you, you can blame it on them. So that's it's not because of your God that necessarily that did it. So the Deuteronomical answer, the answer that is posed in both the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and then in the Deuteronomic history, the next books of the Bible, which is to say Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, that component of the Old Testament, the answer that is always kind of brought about is the problem of evil is that Yahweh blesses those who obey God's laws and punishes those who are disobedient. For example, those who forget that God is the God of Israel, Yahweh is the God of Israel, and then start worshiping the other gods. This happens just again and again and again, for example, in the book of Judges, which formulaically talks about how the children of Israel go and start worshiping the gods of the Moabites. And when that happens, God brings the Moabites, brings people in to conquer them and set all kinds of trials on them and things like that. Then they all cry out, they want to be delivered. And so God sends a judge. The judge is able to rescue them. Then they remember that God is their God, and then they remember that for 40 years until the next time when it's the Midianites or the Philistines. So that's essentially the Deuteronomic answer to the problem of evil, which is God's testing you. And so if Yahweh is a just God with rivals, the suffering of the righteous can potentially be dismissed, though, as resulting from sources other than Yahweh. However, if Yahweh is the one universal God, there really aren't any other rivals that can defy Yahweh. And so already in the book of Job, which is written later than these other books that I was just mentioning, the authors of the text are understanding that this traditional Deuteronomic answer doesn't really hold up. They really explicitly point out here, Job is an entirely righteous man, and yet he's made to suffer. And so they realize, okay, it's not just because you're disobedient that you suffer. Nevertheless, Job's friends continue to believe the old argument. So they're making that case. They constantly are telling him, you've done something wrong, you need to repent, and so that you can get back into God's favor. But it turns out they're not correct, and Job holds his ground. So there are several proposed answers. The book of Job isn't the most coherent book because it actually has multiple different authors that have different ideas. Nevertheless, there's a couple answers. And so one is you can't understand the big picture of what the cosmic God is doing. And so this is the speech that occurs at the end of the book of Job as we have it now, God from the whirlwind, who is essentially saying, there's a lot going on here in the cosmos. The cosmos is bigger than you, Job, and you think you can understand it for a second. No, you don't know what's going on. And so this is the idea that if, I don't know, if God stopped this or that from happening, then some other worse thing would happen. And so that could potentially lead ultimately to the Leibnizian philosophy that we're living in the best of all possible worlds because even though there's horrible things happening, any other world would be worse. In other words, anything that got changed by what God is doing. So that's one of the proposed answers that occur already in the book of Job. Another one is that suffering is resulting from God testing the righteous, and certainly that seems to be kind of what the wager is, as Satan, the tempter, the opposition here that is actually doing, which is causing the kind of suffering in order to see whether Job is really righteous or if he's just responding to blessings. All right. So in the same exact way then, in terms of the problem of evil, the idea of hell provides a new proposed solution to the problem of evil. So one of the things that people are able to point to, and they say, well, look, the righteous seem to suffer in this life. Nevertheless, you have to realize that this is just a relatively tiny degree of prosperity and suffering compared to that which could occur in the eternal afterlife. So, obviously mortal life is inconsequential in terms of the time frame over above eternity. And so the idea now is that with afterlife being eternal, the rewards and punishment will become infinite. Okay, so for the second question, the question of afterlife, the development of monotheism also has consequences for the idea of afterlife. So although previously kings like Pharaoh of Egypt had already developed the idea that they would get to join the gods and become gods themselves, as we already saw, the earliest Old Testament writers don't really express a lot of concern for afterlife. There's really no mention of it almost. It's just talking about sleeping with the dead. The one exception is when King Saul goes and wakes the spirit of Samuel that has been sleeping by going to a witch, going to a necromancer, who is able to wake up the spirit of the dead prophet. But he just wants to tell off Saul and go right back to sleep. So there's really very little examples. So continued life through posterity was really sufficient to Abraham. In other words, this idea of identifying with kin group that continues on. So the idea, though, of the God as one source included the concept that ideas or forms like goodness are eternal or timeless. And so that gets fully developed by Plato and his successors, Neoplatonists, Neoplatonists, and everybody else. But in general, it's just a general idea, I think, as well, of dualism, of fighting good versus evil, is a conception that there is such a thing as good, that is an eternal and timeless concept. And so this new foundational idea raises the question of whether human identity has an eternal component. And so speculation on this question yielded several possible answers. That human identity is finite and ends at death. And you can imagine not everybody likes that idea. Or that humans have an immortal component. And so then what happens, right? And so there were several different proposals. So one, there's a spirit I'm calling it here, a spirit that continues after death in a spiritual realm. To be a spirit that is reincarnated into a new body, or to see a spirit that will be reincarnated when a whole new world is created, resurrected, essentially. And all of these are proposed in various places in what we call the axial age. And so obviously the idea of reincarnation gets very much popularized in Hinduism and Buddhism in the Indian subcontinent, but it also existed in Greece among the Pythagoreans, for example. It just never took off, really. Plato talks about it. Likewise, the idea that a spirit continues after death in a spiritual realm, that becomes kind of the Greek mainstream. And then the idea that a spirit will be reincarnated into a new body when a new world is created, that's really the Zoroastrian religion. And that becomes, which is to say, the Persian religion. And since Judaism was essentially existing in a province of the Persian Empire, this is the kind of the one that was more influential and became more adopted in Second Temple Judaism by the time of Jesus. So the early Christian idea that evolves after Jesus' time is sort of a hybrid of that first Greek idea of a spirit that lives on in heaven after the death of the body, and then the 2C idea, that Persian influence, this idea that there's going to be a bodily resurrection. So it's a little confusing, I think, actually, in how Christians normally portray this. There's a sense that there is a spiritual life after death that maybe happens immediately. And then there's this idea, though, that ultimately is going to be a resurrected life that occurs after the day of judgment. And so I think that Christians sometimes have a fairly muddled view about when is heaven and hell actually taking place? Are people immediately upon death, are they up in heaven and down in hell, or is nobody in heaven or hell yet and they're waiting for the day of judgment? Anyway, so that portion's a little bit muddled, I think, just because of those hybrids. Okay, so so there's some problems with the solutions, I think. So I think that although hell proposes a solution to the problem of evil, the solution also kind of creates a new problem of evil. So it turns out that forever is longer than just a very long time. And so one of the questions that has emerged, certainly in modern times, philosophically and ethically, is it ever possible, how could it possibly be just to condemn anybody to punishment forever, no matter how bad they are? I mean, in other words, any horrible thing that you would have done in this finite amount of time is still going to be finite, and the punishment is eternal. And is that possible for a just God to punish everyone eternally? And so certainly in modern times, a religion developed out of Christianity called universalism. Ultimately, the heir is the Unitarian Universalist, but other Christians are still Universalists. The idea that at some point or other, salvation is universal, which is to say nobody is going to be condemned to hell forever. Nobody faces eternal punishment because that would be totally unjust. That said, the counter argument to that ever is, if you're going to make the case that salvation and eternal reward ultimately are universal to everybody, then you're going to have to say, you're more or less saying that means Hitler's, ultimately, because you have to take that worst example, right? And so that means ultimately everybody is universally saved, right? And so that's always the counter argument here to this universal argument against this solution to the problem of evil. So my question at the end of this exploration, as we've seen hell as an idea that didn't originally exist within Judeo-Christianity, Judaism that eventually becomes, that Christianity launches itself out of, if it didn't actually exist, and we can see how it arose as a need to answer this philosophical question through the influence of Greek philosophical and Persian Zoroastrian religious ideas, if it doesn't actually answer the problem of evil adequately, does the idea still retain any utility? And I'm going to leave that open to all of you as we go into a question phase. And so this is my idea anyway of the intervention of the idea of hell and its development, and some of my musings on that, and I'm interested to hear your musing as well. I'll also going to mention, just for the folks of you who are joining from the local history, theology, philosophy lecture group, we often have a Zoom meeting afterwards for the just to catch up and everything like that. I'm just not going to be able to do that this week because we are preparing for our hymn festival that we're having on Friday. So we'll catch in with you guys next week. But I want to invite any your feedback and your questions and comments. Hell, what's it good for, kind of thing. But also what your thoughts are. Were you raised in an idea where you were taught to believe in a very literal hell, or do you believe in a very literal hell now? And what is that? How did that affect your worldview? Have you changed your ideas as you've gotten older, or are we pretty well done with the idea of hell? We don't talk about it anywhere near as much as we once did. Certainly in my my denomination and Community of Christ, I was visiting with just a dear friend and mentor, Barb Howard. I was at Dick and Barb Howard's house, and Barb was she had the sermon for her congregation the following Sunday, and she said it was going to be difficult because it was on the temptations of the devil that the devil had of Jesus, and she says, and the trouble is, I don't believe in the devil. And so, which I think is not an uncommon position within ministers and leaders in Community of Christ. All right, so a question we have here is, Rowan Wagner asks, can you expand on your thoughts on Zoroastrian influence over Judaism and the idea of hell? So, yes, certainly. Yeah, we got a lot of shorthand in the course of this lecture. We have had whole lectures in the past on Zoroastrianism, and so I invite people to look at that in our archives. But the idea of it is that Zoroastrianism is sometimes cited as the first world religion, which is to say a religion that emerges beyond the kind of the polytheist, the pantheon of gods style, to have sort of a big picture cosmological view. And so the prophet Zarathustra, the prophet Zoroaster, who's really prehistorical, so somebody who we only know of through the texts that we have, the most ancient scriptures of the Zoroastrians, is already talking about essentially a one God kind of concept. There is one great God, Ahura Mazda, who is light and wisdom, and then Ahura Mazda is opposed by one cosmic force of evil, the Angri Mainyu, and so this is really early, and so there is a cosmic, universal God, and then there is a cosmic incarnation of evil, and there is also a conception in Zoroastrianism of a cosmic battle between the two. There's the idea that history is finite, that there's going to be, in other words, that this cosmic battle is going on and on, but it will end. And at that time, Ahura Mazda, God, the good God, will defeat evil, will defeat the Zoroastrian devil. At that point, there will be a day of judgment. There will be a savior, a day of judgment, and a resurrection, and that the spirits of the people who were just and good will be resurrected and live in a paradise. Paradise is actually a Persian loanword into English, and that the people who are judged to have not been righteous will be consigned into hell. And so it predates, presumably, we can't say for sure because we don't, the written record is missing, and so we can say, based on linguistic evidence, these conceptions within Zoroastrianism predate their appearance in Second Temple Judaism. And so Zoroastrianism is generally understood to have had a pretty significant effect. And certainly what's tantalizing is ideas of heaven, hell, savior, judgment, end of the world, afterlife. All of these are existent in the Zoroastrianism and don't exist in First Temple Judaism, and then become very prominent in Second Temple Judaism, and then its child Christianity. So Maggie, hopefully that answers that a little bit. Maggie writes, my question always was growing up about hellfire and brimstone. Baptist, if God is omnipresent and omnipotent, how can a devil and hell even exist? And so in that sense, so Maggie's got a good point here. And so in Zoroastrianism, so Zoroastrianism is sometimes called a dualist religion because essentially Angri Mainyu is super powerful. It's not simply a fallen angel, but it's also just a god of evil, right? And so there is a real full-on divine cage match going on here. Ultimately, Ahura Mazda is going to win, but it's not because there's so much more powerful God and so much littler devil kind of thing. And so to Maggie's point, to the extent that God really has become understood in Christianity and in Judaism in the West as omnipotent, omniscient, all of the different understandings of the one God, then no matter how big you try to make the devil a fallen angel who is simply a creation of that God, it doesn't actually absolve God of any of the responsibility for any of the things that the devil is doing, because ultimately God is allowing those things to happen, since God is all powerful, and anything that the devil is doing is through inaction, at least on God's part. And so to Maggie's point, I'm not sure that it does provide a perfect solution to the problem of evil, because in fact God has to be allowing it. And so there's therefore additional explanations for the problem of evil that Christian theologians and philosophers have tried to make, other than simply a fight with a very powerful cosmic force. Rather, generally it's understood something to do with the exercise of free will necessitates allowing evil to continue into the world, or so on. And so Maggie Feld also asks, if Jesus went to hell to save the souls there, doesn't that lean towards a universalist idea? And so, yeah, certainly that's one of the ways that the universalists were able to draw out that idea. This idea that ultimately Jesus's atonement is infinite, and so that grace is infinite, that ultimately everybody, no matter where they are going to be able to participate in that kind of a grace, and there's that precedent. But then there's other kinds of different ways that people have argued against that. Certainly in the Latter-day Saint conception that existed in the early Restoration, continues in some of the forms, is that the death and spirit world is different than the ultimate heaven and hell conception that'll happen in the after judgment. That this is simply a momentary period of spirit paradise and prison, and essentially Jesus is entering the spirit prison to release the spirits, so that they're but judgment is still coming. So it's not that everybody agrees, but that's certainly one of the ways that people went. Bell Song writes, hi, John and Leandro. Can you comment on modern Jewish and Zoroastrian concepts of hell? Oh, that's good. So modern Zoroastrianism, as I've gone and visited the Zoroastrian temple here in Toronto several times with Encounter World Religions, I've asked them a bunch of times. So the modern Zoroastrians definitely don't consider themselves to be dualists. They consider themselves to be monotheists. And so Ahura Mazda, God is God. And so I have not asked them about whether they're universalists at all. Um, uh, so I don't know. I don't know that particular answer. I think that in terms of Judaism, there is a bunch of different conceptions. I think not all Jewish people believe in afterlife, and there is a persistent um, ideas even through Second Temple Judaism. When you get to for example, the books of Maccabees, the Sadducees, they specifically also are not don't see that afterlife exists as an idea in the earliest parts of the Bible. So in that sense, I think there's substantially less focus on afterlife in Judaism, and in that sense, it would be more similar to Community of Christ, where we really don't focus on afterlife and don't talk about it a lot. I mean, we talk about maybe becoming one with God in the eternities and not being in a place of division and that kind of a thing, but I think are not really focusing on if you're going to have wings and a little robe and play the harp and this kind of thing. I think is not really like a part of our major focus, and we aren't specifically talking about hellfire all the time, or at least not in my congregation that I can remember. And I think that it's going to be more similar in lots of components of Judaism where it's not a point of emphasis. Need to see that Brian Caruana is watching, and so I'm very happy. And Brian is in the middle of Encounter World Religions virtual week, and so we're hoping that's going very, very well. Not seeing this question though. Oh, here it is. So, in the Canaanite religion, there was no hell, but the idea of desolation of sea and desert. Life was fragile in between these two barren domains that are conquered by Baal, who actually dies there. To what extent do you think that this influenced the concept of hell in early Christianity? Well, so it's hard to know exactly. So I'd say that obviously Canaanite religion is in the background, certainly of what's going on. So I mentioned there's these major intellectual forces that are happening from the Persians and the Egyptians, but the kind of the backdrop, I'm sorry, Egyptians and Greeks, but what's happening as a backdrop is the native religion of Syria, Palestine, Israelites, and indeed Israelite pantheon in the first temple is emerging out of the Canaanites. But what I would say here in terms of this, that there is a difference between the cultivated zone, the part of the world that they're living in, and then they're on the edge of a desert and someplace where that life can't be and grow or anything like that. And certainly in terms of for Christians, the main encounter that Jesus has with the devil in the Gospels, as we mentioned, is him wandering in the wilderness, wandering in the desert to be tempted by the devil. And so I think that there is probably some overlap of the conceptions. We have this idea of this extremely hot and barren and desolate place. I think that if Christianity had emerged in Scandinavia, growing out of Norse and Viking religions, I don't think that they would be talking about hell as this really nice and warm and hot place. I think that the Viking hell is essentially being frozen to death, because that's how they're seeing the edge of their universe, that the warmth is actually a positive thing, the paradise thing, when you're up in that kind of a climate. So I think that probably in terms of the environment here, in terms of our conception of hell, that the fact that it's emerging out of this Canaanite desert zone is one of the reasons why we have all this fiery imagery. But the other idea of it is the cosmological part, which is this idea that the Earth is that hell is existing under the surface of the earth, and we are aware because of volcanoes and hot springs and all these other things in certain places that there's fiery stuff that's going on down there. And so I think it's the awareness of natural phenomenon like volcanoes and things like that make people imagine hell as having those kinds of physical attributes. Okay, Elizabeth writes, both Philip Pullman and Ursula Le Guin have what are, in Christian terms, a harrowing of hell, but for both of them, the souls from the afterlife, which is a dreary place, dissolve into the life of the world. She also writes, I also pulled out my Robert Frost to look at his play about God and Job's wife, and God in this play admits to Job that he was just showing off to the devil. So yeah, I would say, here that this idea that, so that's a solution in the first place that Elizabeth is talking about, that rather than be punished for all eternity and that just is never going to end, that there would be a dissolution where you simply are no longer experiencing like an ongoing consciousness of torture, but rather are dissolving into essence or whatever of eternity. There's been a lot of recent exploration of that, where people are arguing that all human consciousness style eternal life, and so if you're going to be living on for all eternity, no matter what, is going to be, no matter how wonderful it is going to end up being torture at some point in infinity. And so, for example, there's a great philosophical thought experiment comedy series that ended a year or so ago called The Good Place. And so I guess I shouldn't do a spoiler, but anyway, the idea of it ultimately that they are proposing is that you may not want to live in even the best heaven forever, and they have an argument against that they play out dramatically in some of the episodes. And that also was recently a case that they just argued in the latest Star Trek show, Star Trek Picard, where Picard, anyway, has the option essentially of being in a body where he could live forever, and that decides that, and so did Data, and so they decide that that's also not something that they want to do, that mortality gives meaning. So that's an argument that people have proposed. They haven't convinced me of that yet, but anyway, so that's something that is certainly an option. It's something for philosophical exploration. Maggie Fao writes, are Israelites emerging from Canaanite background or from Persian background? So most all archaeologists at this point and linguists determined that that there really is no genetic or linguistic or cultural difference between the ancient Canaanites and Israelites, their neighbors, and the identity is simply kind of one of labeling and one of deciding and one of grouping around political and religious leaders and practices and activities. And so they are emerging in the First Temple period out of the Canaanite background. Canaanite is just a word, it's the same kind of thing we say the word Greek. Greek is the Roman word for Greeks. Greeks don't call themselves Greeks, they call themselves Hellenes. But if you read the Greek national epic, the Iliad, they're called everything from the Danaans to, there's a bunch of different names for it. So Canaanite is just the most prevalent Old Testament word for what we also could just simply call Western Semitic peoples, Syrians, Syro-Phoenicians. These are all same people, and the Israelites are also part of that people. The Persians are a different people. So the Persians are, all of those people, the Canaanites, the Israel, Syria, Phoenicians, all of those people, Aramites, all those kind of things they're Semitic people, and they're part of the Semitic language group that includes Arabic and Babylonian and Egyptian. But the Persians are from the Indo-European language group, and so they are the people that are from Persia, from Iran, and from that Iranian plateau, they are able to conquer Turkey and Iraq and Syria and Israel, Palestine, and ultimately even Egypt. And so they create the first great world empire where the Persian king is the king of kings, the Shahanshah. And so he is this first great king of this multi-ethnic state that includes a tolerance for local religion, including Second Temple Judaism. And so it's not that that the Israelites are emerging from the Persians, but they are rather allowed to flourish under the Persians. There's a question, was Lucifer always identified with hell? So as we, the name Lucifer, as we saw, is derived ultimately from Isaiah, where Isaiah is talking about a king of Babylon. And in that passage where we originally see that title appearing, Isaiah is talking about that king getting cast into hell, getting cast into the pit. So in other words, he's dead. He's not a god after all. And so in that sense, yes, because it's always associated with that passage. In terms of other places, that's just the name Lucifer, right? So then there's also the cosmic idea of the devil. Is the cosmic incarnation of evil always associated with the underworld and the dead? I would say not always. So in the Greek world, the Greek pantheon, the guy's name is Hades. He's the king of the underworld, and I don't think he's specifically associated with evil at all. That's not really, it's not a wonderful place. It's not something that you want to be, and that the afterlife is not seen as good. But it's not because you're being down there and punished. It's simply what happens. And so I would say that Hades, even though we use Hades as a synonym for hell, Hades is the god who is the ruler over hell, and so therefore in some senses is the devil, and Satan and Lucifer is not viewed in that same way by the ancient Greeks. And I also don't necessarily think that Angri Mainyu, the devil, the cosmic devil in Zoroastrianism, I don't necessarily think is got specifically control over the afterlife and the souls of the dead and the underworld or anything like that. Although I don't know that for sure. I'd have to see if that is also part of the picture. So that's a good question in terms of those sources. But what I'd say is in terms of the name Lucifer, yes, that's right there at the beginning. Let's see if there are other questions. All right, I am not seeing any more questions. I think there's a lot of great engagement, and so hopefully you found this topic as interesting as I did. And oh, maybe there's one more. We'll see. But in any event, oh, no more questions. And I just want to remind the folks who are from the local group, we'll have a local Zoom meeting next week. Not able to do it this week because there's just a lot going on this week. But anyway, we invite everybody to join us on Friday. We're going to have a hymn festival, which is it's just a lot of fun. So it's a lot of hymn singing, and it's our historic heritage hymns out of the Restoration, and we'll have speakers and lessons coming from around the world. So thank you so much, and remember next week we're going to dive into lost books that didn't make it into the Christian New Testament. So thank you very much.